Good morning, good evening, good day. On behalf of the Operating Board, welcome to the first annual Multi-Stakeholder Forum for the new Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. We get to kick off today's forum with a few welcoming remarks from Microsoft's President, Brad Smith.
Hello, it's my pleasure to help welcome you to this important meeting. I'm Brad Smith, the President of Microsoft. As you all know, Microsoft is serving this year as the chair of GIFCT, and this meeting is obviously a milestone. It's actually pretty striking to think about how far GIFCT has come since 4 companies got together in 2017 to create it. I want to give a huge thank you to the team at Facebook and Sheryl Sandberg, who chaired GIFCT last year, but even more important, I think, is a huge thank you to everybody from both the private and the public sectors that have come together to create what I think we have today, a real organization. A real organization with an executive director and with the chair of the advisory committee. That is a terrific milestone in terms of the kinds of leadership that we can now rely on and work with to move forward. Obviously, this is a critical problem that really requires all of us as companies and participants to think broadly and apply almost an all-hands-on-deck approach. The problems of violent extremism are not getting smaller. What we saw last March in Christchurch, New Zealand, was both a tragic day in and of itself, but also, I think, a warning shot for every country around the world. It did the right thing, I think, in galvanizing us under Prime Minister Ardern's leadership to ensure that we'll do everything we can to avoid having that kind of day of tragedy repeat itself. And already, I think GIFCT has proven its worth with the kinds of concrete steps, including the crisis incidents protocol that you all worked together last year. Now we have a foundation that wasn't there 12 or 18 months ago, a foundation for the future. Certainly on behalf of Microsoft, we're committed to doing everything we can. I'm excited that our team is involved in so many ways, but even more than that, I'm really enthused to see how we've come together as a community from leading governments, a community from leading companies, a community that's working together. Good luck with this meeting. I think it'll provide us with another opportunity to keep moving ahead.
Welcome again. Thank you, Brad. My name is Courtney Gregoire, and I serve as Chief Digital Safety Officer at Microsoft. I also have the honor of serving as your Operating Board Chair for the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism for 2020. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank Facebook, our 2019 chair, and Google, our 2018 chair, for their leadership over the past several years. There is nothing like sitting in the role of chair to truly appreciate their service. Many of you know the history of the GIFCT. In 2017, the 4 founding companies, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Microsoft, committed themselves to a shared mission of preventing the exploitation of the internet by terrorists and advancing human rights. Today and tomorrow, we reflect on the transformation and growth of this organization, and we engage in important discussions about charting the path for its future. Last year, many of us convened at the UN General Assembly in New York for an important announcement, the plan to make the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism into an independent, multi-stakeholder, non-government organization. Facing some unique challenges in 2020, we have put that plan into action. We've hired a tremendous counterterrorism leader as our first permanent executive director, convened our inaugural independent advisory committee, and launched core substantive work through 6 working groups. Turning for the moment to our IAC, I want to thank all of the independent advisory committee members for their dedication and service to strengthen our organization. The 21 members include representatives from 7 governments, 2 international organizations, and 12 civil society organizations, representing a range of expertise from counterterrorism and countering violent extremism to digital and human rights, as well as foundations, advocates, and academics. Our inaugural IAC meeting, convened last month, provided an early window into the valuable contributions this group will provide to strengthen and deepen the GIFCT's work and assess its effectiveness. I want to thank Mr. Bjorn Eiler for stepping up to the role of chair of the inaugural IAC. Over the past year, we have also been tested. Following the tragic attacks in Christchurch, we recognize the need to have a rapid response protocol to minimize viral spread of perpetrator or accomplice-produced content depicting murder or attempted murder. Since March 2019, industry partners have initiated communications in response to over 85 violent incidents. We have activated a full content incident protocol twice. The content incident protocol and our close collaboration has made a difference. Our efforts helped mitigate the viral spread of the attack on a synagogue in Halle, Germany in October 2019, despite identified patterns of media manipulation by those intent on spreading violent content online. And we have advanced research and understanding through the Global Network on Extremism and Terrorism Technology and our partnership with Tech Against Terrorism. Building on the strong foundation from phase 1 of GIFCT's Research Network Initiative, GNET provides important shorter form insight pieces, as well as more comprehensive reports to advance knowledge and understanding. For example, during these challenging times, they've provided several insightful pieces on how jihadists and other extremists are leveraging COVID-19 as an opportunity. Since 2017, the GIFCT partnership with Tech Against Terrorism has held 13 workshops around the world, engaging 140 tech companies, 40 NGOs, and 15 government bodies to focus on knowledge sharing for smaller tech companies and cross-sectional expertise. All of this work has led to this important moment and lays the foundation for a strong future. I want to take a moment and thank the tremendous industry working group for their dedication and commitment to get us here. Brian Fishman, Nick Pickles, Lucy Calladine, Dr. Aaron Saltman, and Dina Hussein. And taking a personal moment, a special thanks to our Microsoft team, Jacqueline Boucher, Zoe Darmay, and Crystal Whitehead. We would literally not be here without you. This past year has been challenging at times, invigorating at times, and certainly not dull. We have built something intentionally unique. The Christchurch call to action was based on the principle that whole of society problems require whole of society solutions. The call articulated the roles and responsibilities of the technology industry, governments, and civil society to be part of the solution to terrorist and violent extremist content online. We wanted the GIFCT to advance this principle, and we're guided by the idea that we are strengthened in this fight by diversity of perspective, experience, and expertise. We need to make sure our future work is built on the strength of multi-stakeholderism as we seek to advance our strategic pillars of prevent, respond, and learn. We need to continually seek out diverse perspectives, adding true global insights into our work. Together, we seek to prevent the exploitation of the internet by terrorists and violent extremists to advance human rights. And we must do this work transparently, guided by the desire to continually improve, continually learn, and continually collaborate. Now, it's my honor and privilege to introduce our Executive Director, Nick Rasmussen. Nick started as Executive Director on June 29th and has hit his home office and virtual meetings running. Since 2018, Nick has served as Senior Director for National Security and Counterterrorism at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. He previously held senior level roles in government, including Director of the National Counterterrorism Center under both Presidents Obama and Trump, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism under President Obama, Director of Regional Affairs in the National Security Council's Office of Combating Terrorism under President George W. Bush, and in critical roles at the U.S. Department of State for more than a decade. He holds academic posts at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, the University of Texas at Austin School of Law, the National Security College of Australia National University, and the Reese Center on Law and Security at New York University School of Law. Welcome, Nick. We are thrilled to have you. Let me virtually pass you the baton.
Great, Courtney. Thank you very much. And, and let me add my own words of welcome to each of you on top of what Courtney has already said. Before we get started, though, just a quick few organizational notes. First, you should all know that this meeting is being recorded, particularly because of the difficulty of holding a conference across really almost every time zone in the world at one time. So after the event, we'll be posting the recordings of both part 1 and part 2 later today on the GIFCT event page for record-keeping purposes. But more importantly, we're doing this all so that you don't have to stay up all night as well. You can consume this at your leisure. You should also know that one of our goals is to make this online forum as accessible as possible, given the inherent limitations of this virtual format. To that end, we've included a live chat function on the event webpage for that purpose, and we hope you will engage with each other and with us via that chat function. And of course, we've also created the breakout room option in session 2 for those of you who are able to join later today and want to engage directly with one of the GIFCT working groups that Courtney mentioned a moment ago. With that, let me again say welcome and thank you for joining. The list of participants we've assembled here virtually is really impressive. We have individuals from almost 30 countries, many different fields of expertise and experience. And most importantly, our audience of participants today reflects a wide diversity of perspectives on the problem set, the problem of terrorism and violent extremism in the online space. Now, speaking personally, the element of this new role that was the most appealing to me was the opportunity to work with a set of passionate stakeholders and colleagues across the globe. As Courtney indicated with a bit of my background, most of my professional life has been focused on the effort to protect our communities from terrorism. But almost all of that time was spent in government, where we often treat the circle of partners, potential partners, as being quite small. We tend to be pretty insular. After all, my world was mostly centered on highly classified information, and we typically only talk to others who are already part of our cleared, classified community. And I don't need to tell you that that's not exactly a great operating principle. And as I've left government service and moved back into the real world, I've come to realize how myopic and limiting that worldview could sometimes be from inside government. And what I now realize is that many of the solutions to our terrorism problems can be found in settings like this one, an open, inclusive environment that includes stakeholders of every kind with every voice. So joining as part of this forum today, we have representatives of 20 different governments around the world, to include governments from North America, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Hopefully next year we can bring Latin America into the fold as well, but we still have a pretty global representation. We also have colleagues from more than 24 universities and other research institutions, again, from all over the world. And we have a similarly global array of representatives and participants from organizations representing various perspectives from civil society. And of course, lastly, we have a diverse set of colleagues from the technology industry as well. By any measure, it's an incredibly rich coalition, and it's united by a single idea. It's an idea that animates our work and brings each of you to this event today, even in the middle of the night. The simple but powerful idea is that collective action across our diverse sectors can and will result in a safer and healthier online environment, an environment that can be far less susceptible to exploitation by terrorists and violent extremists. Now, we all share the view that collective action crosses traditional dividing lines across our many different sectors, and we all have a stake in positive outcomes. We also all know that this work can and must be done in an environment that respects and protects human rights, advances human rights, to include freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So thanks to each of you for being with us at this virtual event. Now, today's event falls, as Courtney indicated, during my 4th week as the head of a newly independent GIFCT. And clearly, being that new, I still have a tremendous amount to learn from every group of stakeholders represented here today. And I hope to continue that conversation directly and personally with most of you. If not physically in person because of travel restrictions, then certainly on a video conference sometime soon. Before we transition to the substantive agenda, let me just say a few words about the manner in which I plan to lead GIFCT in the years ahead. Inclusiveness, transparency, results. From my perspective, these 3 elements will serve as the measures of success, the metrics by which we'll evaluate ourselves in the years ahead. First, inclusiveness. Courtney has already indicated important steps in this regard. GIFCT has already taken important steps towards broadening the base of stakeholders engaged in this work. The stand-up of an IAC, an independent advisory committee with Bjorn as its chair, marks one of those important steps. The creation of 6 very substantively focused working groups is another. More about the groups later today. But there'll be even more that GIFCT can do in the years ahead to be even more inclusive. More companies representing more technological platforms, more voices, more organizations representing a wider span of civil society across the world, more expertise, more research-oriented voices from institutions and universities all over the world, and more governments pursuing public policy responses to meet our online challenges. So my message to you with respect to inclusiveness is that GIFCT has an open door policy with respect to constructive input and innovation. After all, GIFCT was founded to open the door to a broader range of companies that might not themselves have the internal capacity and expertise to stay ahead of terrorist and violent extremist threats, but who still want to be part of solutions. Sharing knowledge, sharing technical approaches and expert insights goes a long way, and we want to continue to expand that pool of shared resources. We know well that not everyone will want to come to the table in a formal way, but our goal is to keep that door open for those that do want to come to the table. Secondly, with respect to transparency, the first thing I would note here is that GIFCT's annual transparency report has been completed and is being posted to our website likely later today. It's an important document and one I hope you will take the time to read. It captures in some detail the work of GIFCT over the last year and makes clear that there's substantial progress to point to, starting with, of course, with the fact that I'm addressing you from this chair as the head of a newly independent GIFCT. And what I pledge to you going forward is a continued commitment to transparency as a core organizational value for GIFCT. And by that, I mean not just in providing an annual transparency report that accounts for GIFCT's work and activities, a sort of shareholder document that is available to all. But I will also commit to transparency when possible in terms of actions that aren't taken by GIFCT. For example, if there is some proposal or idea from some quarter that proves infeasible or not workable, then my commitment is that GIFCT will work to surface specific explanations about why that is so. To my mind, this kind of transparency will go a long way toward breaking down walls that may exist between and among the various communities of stakeholders in our GIFCT universe. Third and last, with respect to results, and by this I mean concrete results which lead to real-world reduction in online activity carried out by terrorists and violent extremists. Because to my mind, that's the only definition of results that really matters. How you actually achieve those results, of course, is equally important. As I noted earlier, our work to address terrorism-related content must be done with regard for fundamental human rights to include freedom of speech and expression. Now, GIFCT has shown in its early years that it can and will be a critically important convener. It will be an aggregator of knowledge, expertise, and capability. You and we are steadily advancing the body of knowledge in our field. That great work has enhanced our collective ability to respond to terrorist and extremist content online. We can be pleased with what we've done so far, but we can certainly not be complacent or satisfied. From my perspective, the next phase of GIFCT's development must be characterized by even more examples of concrete action. And to my mind, the 6 working groups stood up in recent weeks provide the ideal venue for developing proposals for concrete action. These working groups must become, in my mind, the engine room for that work. Each of these working groups, which we'll hear about more in the second session later today, covers a difficult legal, policy, or technical field where real problems exist, but where real progress can also be found. So yes, I'm putting some degree of pressure on each of my colleagues who are serving as working group chairs to meet that challenge in the year ahead. And I hope and expect that when we reconvene in 2021, ideally and hopefully in person somewhere where we can meet, talk, network, and spend time together, when we do that, that we'll have several concrete outputs from the working group process to share, to debate, to discuss, and hopefully to implement. And speaking personally, I hope that one area of concrete progress that we can achieve in the coming years surrounds the question of how to respond to the ever wider and more troubling gray zone of terrorist and violent extremist content. We can all agree that steps to address content are much more straightforward and explainable when they involve established groups that the United Nations has declared to be terrorist organizations. I think we'd all agree that Al-Qaeda and ISIS represent in some ways the low-hanging fruit. But I think we can also agree that this cannot represent the outer limit of what we can collectively do within GIFCT, whether that's via the GIFCT hash sharing initiative or indeed with any other future GIFCT initiative. Let me put that another way. Unless GIFCT is actively engaged in responding to terrorist or violent extremist content from all parts of the ideological spectrum, we're not fully living up to our mission or to our responsibility. And if we fail in that regard, in my mind, GIFCT will deserve to be criticized. So I will welcome the help of everybody in attendance today and a much wider group of stakeholders as well as we try to navigate this set of challenges. Let me finish with a quick last bit of personal reflection as I begin my tenure in this new role. Nobody needs to tell this group that the online environment poses challenges with respect to terrorism and violent extremism, and that's hardly new. But I would argue, as Brad Smith did, that the problem set is getting harder and more complex every year. I think back to 2010 and 2011 when I was serving at the White House at the National Security Council staff. We were first confronted with Inspire magazine, the online magazine published by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. As a senior NSC official at that time, I was right in the middle of government efforts to respond in real time to dissemination of terrorism-related content that posed an imminent threat of real-world harm. I can also remember participating in literally dozens of meetings in the White House Situation Room, some of them including President Obama, as we grappled with how to respond to this aggressive effort by a lethal Al-Qaeda affiliate group to accelerate recruitment, to spread a violent ideology, and worst of all, to share specific actionable information about how to carry out terrorist attacks. And to be honest with you, even back then, we struggled to find practical solutions even to that much more limited and smaller scaled problem set. Sitting here almost a decade later, the problem is bigger, wider, and more difficult. An even broader spectrum of terrorist and violent extremist content exists for us to track and understand. Much greater volume of that material exists as well. We also have an even greater number of online platforms that are potentially vulnerable to exploitation, with new ones being developed every day. And some of these platforms will lack the will and or the capacity to develop effective responses on their own to this challenge. But I'm not going to close on that pessimistic note because there's a lot of reason for optimism as well, starting with this forum. The tools we all bring to the table are so much wider and more diverse than they were in 2010 and 2011. And as this gathering shows, there's a wide community of like-minded colleagues on whom to draw for help in this effort. So again, thank you for tuning in this evening, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for being committed to GIFCT's goals and for bringing, most importantly, your talent, expertise, and passion to the table. With that, let me quickly transition to the next part of the program. It's a real personal privilege to introduce Bjorn Eiler, the chairperson of GIFCT's recently constituted Independent Advisory Committee. Bjorn was elected by his fellow IAC members, and he will serve a 2-year term as chair. Now, as many of you know, Bjorn is an internationally renowned peace activist, as well as a survivor of the 2011 terrorist attack in Norway. He brings enormous expertise and commitment to this role, and we're excited that he will be part of GIFCT's work in the years ahead. So Bjorn, let me turn the floor over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nick. The attack in 2011 happened 9 years ago yesterday. And so I think this is a great way of marking that anniversary in many ways of taking on this new role as chair of the Independent Advisory Committee. The last decade has been marked not only by drastic and ever-changing dynamics in violent extremist movements, but also by a revolution in technologies tying us all together. It's been amplifying the voices both of human rights defenders calling for justice and of extremists spreading harmful content and propaganda seeking to divide and incite violence in our communities. My work, as I see it, has largely been about building bridges between young grassroots activists I have had the honor of working with and political leaders at every level, from local governments to the United Nations, between civil society organizers who every day depend on technology to support their cause, to those designing policies for content on the digital platforms. Having a foot both in the world of emerging technology as a designer and developer and in policy as an advocate has given me a unique perspective with regards to the ethical, legal, and political ramifications of technology and its role in radicalization into violent extremism that leads to terrorism. I personally define violent extremism as the violent denial of diversity. After years of working with former extremists from across the spectrum, it seemed clear to me that one thing unifying all extremists, regardless of their ideological belongings, was the inability to peacefully coexist with the people they saw as radically different from them. Extremists try to eradicate diversity by enforcing some form of conformity. All white supremacists want everyone in their society to be white. All members of ISIS want everyone in their society to follow their interpretation of Islam, etc. In order to extend this definition to terrorism, we need to delve more into the definitions of violence. Building on the work of fellow Norwegian Johan Galtung, violence can be seen primarily in three forms: as structural, cultural, and direct. While violent suppression of diversity certainly could take all three forms, I personally think it's important to fight against all forms of violence and oppression. I tend to narrow it down to direct violence when it comes to who I define as terrorists. A terrorist is thus someone who has used direct violence to deny a diversity of someone who has supported such, or someone who has supported such acts committed by others. We see this in the spread of content in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, as well as content that is designed to incite violence and recruit people to extremist organizations and to commit violent acts and acts of terrorism. These definitions are by design trying to ensure that what I see as legitimate political opposition and work for human rights does not fall under the definitions of violent extremism. At the time when I was thinking a lot about this and developing these definitions, I was working a lot with journalists and academics and human rights activists who all, to some extent, were accused by governments of supporting terrorism and thus having a crackdown on their freedom of speech. And it is important that we keep that in mind as we continue our work against terrorism, that we don't allow for the abuse of authoritarians and human rights abusers of our work. In my career, I've had the great privilege of working with a lot of people from across the world and working at a range of levels to try to change societies for the better. And I do admire the work of young human rights activists from across the world who have been concerned about radicalization in their neighborhoods as well as at international levels, and who have started grassroots activities from conversation groups at the neighborhood level to advocating for policy at the United Nations level and at other international and national levels. I admire these human rights activists I have been working with who have been standing up for freedom of expression and democracy despite crackdowns and imprisonment from authorities, as well as who have been standing up against terrorists and terrorist organizations in some of the regions of the world that has been most affected by organizations like the Islamic State, by Boko Haram, and by far-right extremists. All of these colleagues of mine have been staying true to who they are in crisis and show and have been staying true to their principles when life has shown its ugliest face. And that in itself is a great achievement. We have to stay true to the principles that we believe in, the freedom we believe in, the liberty to exist that we believe in. That is what separates us from the terrorists. And so staying true to that is at the core of what we must do in order to have an ethical framework for the work that we are doing when countering terrorism. As chair of the Independent Advisory committee, my first priority will be to make sure that we create a solid structure for the work of the committee and develop good relationships and channels to work with the operating board, with the staff and the members of the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, and to promote our overall goal of countering terrorism online through effective means. It will also be important to me to make sure that we listen to the voices of diverse stakeholder groups, giving sufficient time and space both to the representatives of governments and of civil society, as well as to other groups that might be external to the Independent Advisory Committee, but represent important viewpoints to consider. In this, I think a particular focus should be on also listening to the users of the platforms and tools represented in the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. To me, it's also important that we keep in mind the fact that several of the members of the GIFCT has an unprecedented user mass, representing more individual users than any other entity has done throughout human history. The work of the IIC and the GIFCT thus has the potential for massive reach and impact in a diverse range of locations with vastly different ways of life, legal structures, and political culture. Because of this, it is important that we build a solid ethical foundation, keeping human rights, the universal application of policy and law, checks and balances, and other structures to limit the potential, whether it's accidental or intentional, of abuse of power or disenfranchisement of legitimate groups at a minimum. I am incredibly excited to take on this role as chairperson of the IIC, and I wish to thank the members of the committee for electing me to this role. And I look forward to working with all the members of the committee, as well as with the members of the GIFCT, all of the working groups, and the staff and UNIC. And so thank you all for having me and for giving me this opportunity, as well as for providing this network and this platform through which I hope we all can achieve some of our goals in preventing and countering the spread of harmful materials and terrorism-related content across the platforms. Thank you again, and back to you, Nick.
Thank you as well, Bjorn. And again, I think I can speak for everybody that's in the audience. It's pretty obvious the critically important voice that Bjorn brings to the table, and why we are so thrilled to have him as chairperson of our IAC going forward. So thank you, Bjorn. Now let me quickly turn to the substantive centerpiece of the agenda for this first session. We've had some introductory remarks so far, but we definitely wanted to make a move into a more substantive discussion. And that will be a presentation and discussion on the current threat landscape that brings us all together. I'd like to introduce my friend, Dr. Shiraz Maher, to guide us through this part of the program. Now, as most of you already know, Shiraz is a renowned scholar based at King's College in London, where he heads up the ICSR, he also leads our GNET, our intellectual partner, our academic and research partner for GIFCT. And we're very pleased with the work that GNET has done over the past year to put us in a particularly advantaged place with respect to research and academic progress. After Shiraz speaks, he will have a set of 4 distinguished colleagues who respond and provide additional context and commentary on the threat landscape as he's portrayed it. We're very lucky to have 4 distinguished panelists: Farah Pandith, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations; Lydia Khalil, Research Fellow at the Lowy Institute in Sydney; Hamish Hansford, First Assistant Secretary at the Department of Home Affairs in Australia; and lastly, Adam Hadley, Founder and Director of Tech Against Terrorism, another critical partner in GIFCT's work. And before I transition back to you, Shiraz, just a quick word about Tech Against Terrorism. They do incredibly important analytical work to support GIFCT's mission, but they also play an important role in helping prepare and mentor companies that want to enter this space of dealing with content challenges. And so we're very grateful to Adam and his team for the work that they do. So with that, Shiraz, let me turn things back to you and look forward to the conversation about the threat landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. I know we have people all over the world, including many distinguished and respected friends and colleagues who work in this space. So it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to present to you today. Nick asked us to look at the evolving threat landscape 2020 update. And within the context of GNET, which you've heard a little bit about, and I'll speak more about it towards the end of this presentation, we really wanted to go far and wide. So this is a sort of blue sky thinking encapsulation of what we regard the threat to be within the true remit or the fullest remit of GNET. GNET is there to look at the intersection of how terrorists are interacting with technology. So it's not just about extremist content online, although I'll speak a little bit about that, but as I say, the full gambit of terrorism and tech. And so this presentation goes through some of those things, and I'll just put that up as a quick sort of structure. So there's three broad areas that I'll talk about, as I say, a sort of 30,000 foot view or assessment of some of those issues. And then I'll just finish with a small introduction to GNET before I hand over to the respondents. I think it's worth saying we've seen what we're calling the sort of creation or accentuation of digital ghettos. And that online environment has broadly changed since 2013 to 2016, when of course a lot of the terrorist content was widely available on mainstream platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And we all know that that environment has changed in the intervening years. The thing about the content, of course, being on those platforms was it had a huge advantage. It was able to be spread to very, very wide people. So it was easily accessible, and it lowered the barriers as a result to high risk activism. And so some of this here shows you in the sense of how ISIS supporters were engaging with mainstream platforms in order to spread some of their content. And of course, they, like other malevolent actors within this space, highly prioritize media and highly prioritize propaganda. And they recognize it as an integral part of what they're doing. So one of the famous slogans being half of jihad is media. And you can see some of the visually arresting pictures here in terms of how they regarded their presence on these platforms as being something intrinsically or inherently linked to the campaigns that they were waging, the real world campaigns they were waging on the ground in theaters such as Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. With that environment becoming much more challenging, and with that environment becoming more inhospitable for them to operate on these mainstream platforms, you saw them migrating towards other platforms such as Telegram. Telegram, of course, if we'd been speaking even just 18 months ago, 12 months ago, would have been the primary platform on which jihadist actors at least were gathering and were looking to spread their propaganda. Of course, Telegram has had a pretty sustained, serious campaign against them for about 7 to 8 months now. That has made the environment a lot more inhospitable for them. But this gives a sense of the way that they were moving onto some of those platforms. And of course, what this does is it creates a more concentrated environment. For those of you, and I know a number of you on this call are already operating in places like Telegram, it's of course not as easy and not as user-friendly as a platform like Twitter or Facebook or any of the other mainstream platforms. So what it does is it creates barriers to participation. It creates barriers also to finding this content. But of course, when it slips away into these slightly more protected environments as well, it is able to spread a slightly more menacing message than it would be able to on a mainstream platform. We're also seeing that, of course, with the far right and with the again, creation of digital ghettos in places such as Gab or increasingly Parler. So you'll see in two of the screenshots here, we have activists, well-known UK activists, I'm sure internationally known as well, such as Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins, who have no longer been able to have a platform on places like Twitter and have therefore retreated to Parler, which they regard as a slightly more user-friendly platform for them in order to try and spread their message. And of course, again, with Gab, famously, of course, used by the Tree of Life terrorist who famously said, "Screw your optics, I'm going in." And again, showing the kind of material that's being able to spread on those types of platforms in a way that you couldn't do in a slightly more mainstream way. It's worth saying that this was a small pamphlet produced by a supporter of Islamic State who was telling really other members and other sort of supporters of the group not to forget about Twitter. And that sort of really underscored just how important a platform like Twitter was to them, insofar as it became a great way by which to get your message out there and by which to recruit others to come and join your organization in terms of coming and being part of what it was that you were doing on the ground. And as I said before, having a presence on a big mainstream platform allowed for accidental users to find you. So if you were just a curious person who happened to have a Twitter account, you could just start to search for some of this content and to seek out some of these groups. Whereas now, if you're just an ordinary person who doesn't work in this space, who isn't active in this area, and you want to start to try and seek out some of this content, there are already barriers to you doing so, insofar as you'll have to create a new account on a sort of second or third tier platform, and then familiarize yourself with it, and then try to find it. So that in and of itself makes it harder and more challenging to access. But as I say, it creates these concentrations. And we can see with this pamphlet as well, just how important the mainstream broad market access is to them. And so this is really lamenting their inability to operate on Twitter at that time. So the next issue I'll look at is that of emergent technologies. We've seen, again, emergent technologies that create new opportunities for attack planning and social disruptions. Three things in particular I'll talk about here, which is weaponization of commercial drones, 3D printing to prosecute attacks, and live streaming. So it was well known in parts of Raqqa and in Iraq that Islamic State had begun to weaponize commercial drones in order to drop grenades on SDF, that's the Syrian Democratic Forces, who were advancing on their positions. Of course, this is not to suggest that Islamic State had a sophisticated or well-developed drone capacity, but nonetheless, what it did demonstrate was a proof of concept. And for these types of groups, having these proofs of concept, having these sort of early test cases has proven to be a huge factor in terrorist innovation and sort of strategic development over time. So we did see grenades that were able to be dropped by drones proving relatively effective in causing some degree of challenge and problems for SDF forces who were fighting against them at the time. In the bottom right-hand corner, although it wasn't a terrorist incident, it does demonstrate the ability to have drones up near airports. We had huge disruption in the UK at Gatwick Airport with this drone a few years back, which went on for several days. And so again, what you may see is, again, discussion of weaponization of commercially available drone technology, and then its weaponization in particular contexts, as we've seen in Syria and Iraq so far. We've also seen, of course, in Germany with the Halle attack, 3D printing. This is something I'm quite interested in, insofar as the ability of terrorists to print 3D guns and to use them in terrorist attacks. In this incident, of course, 2 people were killed, but the overall ambition of the terrorist was to kill many more people. And again, good fortune and the failure of these guns at crucial moments meant that there wasn't more carnage and more people being killed. But I think, again, it speaks to the fact that as these technologies become better, as they become more readily available and the quality improves, then you could, again, see malevolent use in this way in a number of other cases. So 3D printing, again, remains a challenge in this space, and something that over time we would expect to see more development and use by terrorist actors. And then finally, again, we've seen in battlefields such as Syria and Iraq, but also, of course, with the Christchurch attack, live streaming with GoPros and other bits of kit in order to produce real-time content of a war or of a terrorist attack streamed to your supporters and friends, designed to inspire, and of course, also has this rather gamified feel to it as a sort of first-person shooter that many people have played on sort of popular platforms, PlayStation, Xbox, those types of things. And so, again, that sort of create an ability to bring war home to people who may be supporting you, or I say to bring an attack home to your own supporters as well. And so we've seen this again increasingly used in battlefields such as Syria and Iraq, and it will feed into the next aspect of what I wanted to talk about, which is the weaponization of open source information. This is really about creating online campaigns for real world harms and taking ordinary, everyday, pretty easily available information that in most contexts is there for fairly benign purposes, but of course weaponizing it into a malignant cause. So Islamic State at one point had a so-called hacking division. It had various people who had a degree, albeit limited, of computer proficiency. And they released the home addresses of various members of the United States Armed Forces and also those working in other sort of related fields. And so the picture on the left is showing you one sort of deck of cards that they had made, essentially identifying individuals and their personal details. And on the right-hand side there, giving out those addresses and passwords and so on for those individuals. So again, just weaponizing information that had actually already been out there. It wasn't the result of some intelligent or sophisticated hack that Islamic State had done on any sort of secure database. This was information that already existed in the public domain, but of course presented them with a propaganda win in terms of their ability to present that information and to put it out there for clearly very, very malignant purposes. We've also seen in the UK, I'm not sure if this is happening with the far right elsewhere, but activists such as Tommy Robinson, who were doorstepping individuals, again, taking information that is fairly easily available to find out where people live in the UK, and then turning up at their houses in the middle of the night in order to intimidate them. And this is one individual, Mike Stutchbury, who Tommy Robinson had waged a long campaign against, and then of course turned up at his house, intimidating him in the middle of the night. And you can see there some Telegram screenshots where people were attacking him as well. So this has a huge destabilizing effect on individuals when it is done. Of course, nothing illegal about any of this in terms of turning up at someone's house, but clearly putting this information up on the internet as well, while someone like Tommy Robinson might be slightly more careful and more intelligent about how he's going to act when turning up at your home. Putting this information out there on a much broader context can leave all kinds of people to do things. So you can see in the top left-hand side here, someone drove about 70 miles to Mike's house in order to leave a note there threatening him. You can see the address had gone up on Gab and elsewhere on a number of platforms. And then on the left-hand side, again, at the bottom there, Mike's put up screenshots from Facebook where people had messaged him threats after watching this live stream. So it's that sort of encapsulation, just the ordinary, everyday technology and the ordinary, everyday information weaponized in a highly destabilizing way for individuals who become the target of such campaigns. So those are the three broad aspects, as I say. I just wanted to flag up for the context of this discussion in terms of what we'd seen the team at GNET as being sort of broader challenges in this space. And so it leads me to tell you a little bit about GNET for those who don't know too much about it. GNET is the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, and it's the academic arm of GIFCT, helping to better understand the ways in which terrorists are using technology. So we're very much part of GIFCT and feeding into the broader aims of the organization and Nick's vision in that respect to inform discussions in this space with academic research. And our vision for GNET is to turn into the leading academic research portal and repository for work in this area, which is why we've given it its own dedicated website. I'm sure many of you are aware of it, but if not, please do check it out, GNET-research. And that's presenting us with this opportunity to not just have the old traditional kind of reports that you will have seen and read, but also this faster turnaround insight aspect of the website, which is providing academic commentary in real time on pressing issues. So we've created a special section on coronavirus and the way in which extremists and terrorists are reacting to the challenges presented by COVID-19, for example. We have a global consortium. Our strapline has been global coverage, local expertise, bringing together partners from all over the world in order to help us understand these issues and to really tap into those local networks wherever they exist in order to have a better understanding from people on the ground in those communities, in those environments, who can help inform us all about challenges in their region, in their language set, and so on. When we began at GNET, we essentially set out with one overarching research question that we wanted to ask and to explore or interrogate, and that was the ways in which online extremist behaviors and content create offline real-world harms, and how mitigation activities against those behaviors interact with normative social concerns, including freedom of expression and conscience, privacy, and human rights. And so that's the broad umbrella of our sort of research focus in this context. We have then 6 research teams. I won't read them all out. They're there for you on the screen. They're also on the GNET website. But again, these are sort of slightly more targeted areas in terms of where we'd like to do things, and certainly around some of those issues, like in point 2, balancing user privacy, state security, and human rights is very important for us. And based on actually some of the working groups discussions that took place yesterday, Charlie and I are in the process of reaching out to people who can help us produce some research around that. So these are the sort of broad 6 areas that we're looking at in this context. GNET has a large digital footprint, so it has its own dedicated logo and website, has a strong presence on the web in that sense. We've had more than 70,000 unique page views since we launched in January. We've almost got 1,000 subscribers to our mailing list. Again, GNET has its own dedicated mailing list. So if you are on the ICSR mailing list, you won't be getting GNET updates. We run a dedicated mailing list for that. So again, if you're not subscribed to that, please do join it. Please encourage your networks to sign up to it too. We're very much in the process of building this out. And again, it's our ambition, at least, to have this being built out to become the real repository for all kinds of research within this space. And so that's it from me. There's the website. If you are not writing for GNET, but are interested in writing for GNET, we take contributors from all over the world. The more places, the better, as far as we're concerned. And so again, please just reach out and mail at gnet-research.org. And we'll be in touch in order to see the ways that you can contribute and help us in that respect. So I will stop there and hand over to the first of our respondents, which is Farah Pandit.
Hello, thank you. And that was a really excellent overview of the threat landscape. And it reminded me of how we think about what a threat is. And I remember being at the National Security Council when there were tsunamis happening in Indonesia. And we got some information that Al-Qaeda was spreading around, a rumor, a conspiracy, that in fact the reason why the tsunamis were taking place was because America had a weather switch that they were turning on and off to make this happen. And this conspiracy went all around the world. We thought it was really funny at the time. And I think to myself, what would have happened if we had taken a bigger role in the idea of conspiracies? If we had thought about the threat landscape in a forward-leaning posture, what could actually have happened? And there's not a lot of point in looking backward in time. The point today is to think about what the threat landscape is in 2020 and what might be coming down the pike. And toward that end, when we assess the landscape, it is to account for what we both see in front of us and things that we can predict based on some signals that we are getting right now. So what I'd like to do is to take my few minutes and respond to Shiraz, who rightly outlined 3 very important areas of change that are taking place today. But I also wanted to bring up 8 aspects that I think are really important as we think about not just where we are today, but what's going to come down the pike. I will say that some of the research and analysis is my own, obviously, but some has been drawn from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, in particular, Milo Comerford, Jacob Davey, and Julia Ebner, who've done excellent research, and you'll see where I'm going. So on the first piece of information that I call the big bleed, there is a new massive change that's taking place in the mainstreaming of far-right conspiracy theories that are going to definitely change the way in which we understand the threat that we're facing in the online space. And I think it's very important to understand, all of you know, that nothing happens in an online space that is not first happening in an offline space. And that connectivity is extremely important for us to understand. So that big bleed is really key. It's shifted. Secondly is the demographic issue. I think we were very late to the game, and I think it's a very important piece to understand that 50% of the world's population is under the age of 30 today. And yes, they're all digital natives. And yes, there is data that tells us how they operate in an online space, what millennials are doing, what Gen Z is doing. But I will tell you that we are not doing enough on the generation Alpha, and understanding not only the fact that they're online as digital natives. They're about 10 years old right now. They came into being when the iPad was just launching. But very importantly, extremists are targeting this young demographic. We already know that Adam Waffen members are as young as 13 years old. We know that the Daily Stormer founder talked about his target audience being 11. So we have to understand what's happening in the child and adolescent mind, and understand how they're using the internet and what they're getting from it. So I think that's a really important component in terms of the landscape that we're dealing with as we're going forward. In addition to that is identity and belonging, which is the centerpiece for everything. For me, as I think about the ecosystem that is underlying extremism, as one of the speakers said earlier in this session, what is actually taking place is this idea of wanting to be exactly right about who they are. And so whether you're the far right or you're the so-called Islamic State, you are bringing forward your identity in a very particular way. And with the context of the changing ecosystems that we're dealing with, whether Black Lives Matter or the COVID era, or the social sinkholes that are being exposed today, hate is on the rise. And so what I really see this as a problem, because not only are we looking at an anti-science environment, but we're seeing a pro-emotional reward environment. And I think that is going to have some very important contours to us as we're trying to deal with the threats that we are seeing today. Speaking of which, the fourth point is that there's going to be more and not less. You hear lots of governments talking about the decrease of the threat from groups like AQ and the so-called Islamic State. But in fact, what we're seeing is, and what we will see going forward, is a recalibration of the threat, and many more kinds of groups, but also groups that are connected to each other in ways that we haven't yet imagined. And I think that is extremely scary, because they're not only are they learning from each other, as we all know, but if we underestimate what that threat is and only look to, for example, the violent far right, or we only look to groups like the so-called Islamic State, we are going to miss a lot in between. I want to pick up on a point that Shiraz brought up in his presentation about the live streaming and the game-like quality of what that is doing to young people who are dealing with an emotional response, but also the identity piece. I think there's far more we need to be doing as we think about the gaming platforms on both Generation Z and Generation Alpha. The next point I want to make is on gender, and we have not at all dissected the way in which males and females differ in how they're using the internet, how they express their identity, how they are activated, and how their networks are being built. And it worries me greatly that we have not had the kinds of conversations around this, because in order to understand how these two different genders are taking advantage of the internet, on top of the demographic piece, we really need to do more research. And that's an opportunity, I think, for some of the collaborators with GIFCT to actually think differently, not just about the platforms, but about how women and young girls are using it differently. The seventh point I want to bring up is the forgotten terrains that are existing as we speak right now. For example, the refugee camps that we're going to have to deal with, or the places in the world that we're looking in another direction. They're part of the landscape in 2020, but they're part of the landscape beyond 2020. And I think that's going to be a really important component for the threat dynamic. And finally, I think that we have been very shallow in our understanding. We say something about global, but we don't really mean it. We cannot be looking at this issue from a Western perspective. We must understand how to connect the dots on identity around the world. Whether you're in Trinidad and Tobago, whether you're in Zanzibar, whether you're in Malaysia, whether you are in India, whether you are in Norway, the way a young person responds to identity is connected. And we are not responding in a global way. And I think it is very important that we connect the dots. I want to leave you with one data point in terms of what is to come in terms of these global conversations. The year 2050 is going to bring the largest population of Muslims anywhere in the world to India. And that is important for a lot of different reasons, including the way in which the subcontinent uses technology and how many hours they spend on it. But the increase of the geopolitical landscape in that part of the world, as well as the conspiracy theories that are driving deep change. And I think we have got to understand both the geopolitical component and the forces of change globally in order for us to have a realistic assessment of where we are and what we must do. So with that, I will leave you with 2 words, and that is think bigger. And that's based on what we've seen over the last 10 years of how we've analyzed. So if we can do that, I think we're going to be in a very forward-leaning posture. If we don't, we will be seeing far more of the backtracking that we have seen because we have not imagined what we should. So I will end there and turn it to Lydia.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you for that. And thank you to Shiraz for that excellent presentation. I appreciate the opportunity very much to learn from it and to be even a part in a small way of the important work that GIFCT is doing to understand not only how dangerous actors use technology and mitigate online harms. And we're doing this through the Lowy Institute's partnership with GNET, as Shiraz highlighted in his presentation. Most of my work has been in the national security policy and counterterrorism positions in the United States, but I've also been fortunate enough to be able to spend a number of years living and working in Australia. And I thought it would be most useful in my response to give you some perspective about what's happening here in Australia and the Asia Pacific, in addition to the already very comprehensive overviews given by ICSR and the other experts that we have on hand. And you'll see that some of my points do echo what Farah and Shiraz have said. Hopefully this is not a matter of an echo chamber, but rather a reinforcement of themes that we've been seeing about extremist use of technology. So the first point that I'd like to make, it's not a particularly new insight, but one I believe needs repeating. And that is that the internet has not only broadened the ability for like-minded extremists to connect and to organize, but it has transformed what once were national or local grievances that would have usually have had no resonance globally into international grievance tropes and narratives. And again, this isn't a new phenomenon. We've had globalization ongoing for decades now, but this trend has been sharply accelerated by social media, other internet-enabled communications, and other technologies. So national and local issues seized upon by one extremist groups are spread globally through online platforms, and they're taken up by others worlds away. And in monitoring the far right in Australia, for example, I'm struck by not only how much American far-right narratives, memes, and figures pop up here, but by how the Australian far-right is appropriating local issues in the United States. So one of the many examples of this is, say, how the Australian far right is focusing on the Black Lives Matter movement or the Portland protests. Far-right extremist figures here have been commenting on what's happening in the US, ginning up their followers based on what's happening in another country, far away from their own issues in their own societies and their own communities. And they're not only appropriating opposition to these movements to fuel their own grievance narratives, and they're not only tying it to broader far-right global opposition to the left or Antifa, they are doing that, but something more specific is happening as well. They are as invested in what's happening in the United States locally and discuss what's happening in the United States locally as they would be in what's happening locally in Australia. Now, that's a subtle difference, but it's an important one in that they're trying to mobilize and radicalize, not only because they're concerned about that these movements can gain traction in Australia, but because of the very fact they're even happening in the United States at all. And this is something that we've seen repeated across different national contexts as well, which is very ironic given that extreme right figures and groups hold or tend to hold ultranationalist positions. Now, what I'm discussing about the US and Australia could be one of the more darker manifestations, for example, of the very close US-Australia relationship, but it's one that's accelerated and exacerbated to the internet. Now, related to this point is also the transference via internet technologies of movements that grew out of one context into another, again, aided by digital communication technology. And again, I point to an example of the transference of a movement out of the United States to Australia and elsewhere. And here I'm referring to the sovereign citizens movement. Now, the sovereign citizens movement began in the US around the 1970s, and it's been intertwined with Second Amendment issue, anti-tax and militia movements. And now we've seen a migration of this sovereign citizen trope to other places like Australia, Europe, and elsewhere. Now here it was first reported, I think around 2015 by New South Wales Police that identified this emerging sovereign citizen movement in Australia as a threat. But now we're seeing a recent growth of the Australian sovereign citizen movement during the pandemic in response to public health related restrictions put in place by governments. And the awareness of the sovereign citizen movement and its tropes have been accelerated by online posts, the sharing of viral videos of the so-called sovereign citizens confronting law enforcement or in public defiance of public health restrictions or going online to organize rallies and protests in real life. The second observation I'd make is that we're hearing from extremists themselves that deplatforming works. Now, 2 weeks ago, there was a large online conference organized over Zoom, broadcast on YouTube, of a veritable who's who of the far-right extremist figures in Australia. Now, two speakers that they hyped most for this conference were very well-known Australian right-wing extremist figures who were once very prominent online only a year or two ago. And in both of their presentations, they complained bitterly that they've been deplatformed and that it's limited their ability to reach followers and mobilize actions. Now, the video of this conference was eventually taken down by YouTube and it migrated to other platforms like BitChute, and it's still available there. But the social media account of the organization that put together this online platform and is itself a purveyor of hate speech and extremist content is still up and running on a number of mainstream social media platforms. So, which brings to mind my third point about this, which is that while deplatforming does work, and Shiraz highlighted this in his presentation as well with the Islamic State, because we've seen it in not only in this recent example that I'm giving you, but also in the concerted and coordinated takedowns of Islamic State content in the past, we still need to address how extremist content continues to spread, particularly when it's spread in unsuspecting corners of the internet. Now, Shiraz had mentioned the GNET insights. The most recent one that we put forward from the Lowy Institute was exactly on this topic. And in it, we discussed how even though there's been a recent concerted effort to take down QAnon accounts, for example, QAnon's dangerous conspiracy videos, memes, tropes, and posts, hashtags, they're still being spread by unlikely and understudied and unexamined cohorts online. For example, like the wellness and lifestyle influencers active online. Now, more empirical study needs to be done on this topic, but we are seeing evidence that influencers are sharing QAnon conspiracies by also using the same hashtags and memes that not only QAnon accounts used, but hashtags and memes that far-right extremist actors also used. So to tackle this problem of the spread of dangerous content, we should be examining what other online communities besides identifiable extremist accounts may be inadvertently linking to extremist content or using the same hashtags that extremist accounts also use. So dealing with dangerous content that violates terms of service from lifestyle and wellness influencers, it's going to be a much more difficult process than simply deplatforming known extremist actors, as the influencer space, the social media influencer space, goes to the heart of the social media business model. Fourthly, I would point that the challenge of online extremist narratives, I point to the challenge of online extremist narratives. On the extreme right in particular, they're not only coming up with their own narratives and tropes, they're also largely posting news and posts from the mainstream media. So there's this incredible mainstreaming of far-right narratives, which Farah has also pointed to. And this is a huge challenge for internet companies as they seek to combat online extremism without coming up against accusations of censorship. One very important study that was done a couple of years ago by Victoria University highlighted how mainstream media content was used extensively by far-right groups. And lastly, I just want to end on this note. I would caution that the research and policy effort on dangerous actors and online actors may be a bit too siloed. And by this, I mean that the political and ideological extremists are not the only dangerous actors we're dealing with. There's also state-sponsored disinformation campaigns, dangerous conspiracy movements like QAnon, online hate speech, doxing campaigns, etc. And for the most part, we've been treating these as separate problem areas, particularly state-sponsored disinformation campaigns and extremism. But in fact, they are interlinked and intertwined. Extremist actors pick up on online disinformation, use it to fuel their own narratives and mobilization efforts. And prominent terrorism and national security experts, far more prominent expert than myself, like for example, Clint Wachts, have identified these issues. I will add that in Australia, we're seeing unprecedented levels of foreign interference in the past few years. And foreign interference takes on many forms, but one of them is online disinformation. And we're starting to see this disinformation, or this infodemic, as the UN General Secretary termed it, is spurred by internet-enabled communications and social media. And it's not only impacting electoral democracies or public health efforts, it's impacting extremism. So I just end by urging that we have to take a look at this and tackle this issue holistically, because disinformation campaigns are not only perpetrated by foreign actors for political gain on the international arena, these same state-sponsored disinformation campaigns are fueling polarization that's driving violent extremism. So I'll end my response remarks there. Want to thank you again for the opportunity to participate, and I'll pass the baton to another Australian, Hamish Hannaford, the first Assistant Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs.
Great, well, thanks very much, Lydia. We'll do an Australian two-act in response to Shiraz's very thoughtful and provoking presentation. I thought I'd just briefly comment on three different areas. The first, the threat environment. The second, a few Australian priorities in the context of our collective response. And then look at the usefulness of GIFCT going forward. On the threat environment, it's pretty clear to us that, and I'm sure it is for societies all around the world, that the terrorist and violent extremist threat is really in the context at the moment of COVID-19, bubbling away at the same time as a range of people are isolating and engaging with society in a very different way. We're seeing in Australia, and I'm sure you are across the world, that people are reacting to a different world where we communicate online and we communicate in very different ways than we have before. And in spending more time online, we're seeing a range of different adverse outcomes by people who are contacting our lifeline services or our help services. And when we talk to our law enforcement and security partners, the soft belly of the internet and some of the issues that we're experiencing haven't really changed the threat posed by online terrorism and right-wing extremism. In fact, as Dr. Maher outlined, the concept of digital ghettos that he referred to, I think, is particularly useful in understanding the dark belly of the internet. Equally, the places like the dark web, where not only terrorism and online extremism, but the full range of criminal activities are occurring. And when we're reflecting on the pandemic in particular, we haven't seen a particular slowing down in the rhetoric or propaganda from terrorist groups. We see the intent of terrorist groups to inflict violence remain the same. And in one sense, we really see that terrorist groups in particular are using the pandemic to help them recruit. And extremists we are looking at the moment, we're seeing them take advantage of isolation, loneliness, and indeed financial stress to boost their numbers, both terrorism but criminality more generally, which I think is of interest. And an increase in online activity, we think, is likely to help extremists recruit those who are a little bit more susceptible to online radicalisation. And the combination of the two is potentially tipping people over the edge. In Australia, since September 14, we really have seen that there have been 7 domestic attacks and 18 that have been foiled, and online issues and a connectivity that Shiraz mentioned between the online world and the real world has really demonstrated that in each of those foiled attacks there is an online element. And the dark places of the internet have facilitated a range of different adverse outcomes. For example, in 2014, an 18-year-old young Australian was convinced to travel to Iraq to join Islamic State, died in a suicide bombing attack after having conversations with brothers from the state online. And of course, the awful incident in Christchurch in 2019 it appears, has been heavily influenced by a person who's been actively involved in online extremist communities and then obviously live streamed that attack. But I think over the period we're seeing terrorists and violent extremism actors continuing to adapt and innovate. We're seeing a shift in terrorist content from mainstream to alternative platforms. In future, we can expect to see a greater take-up of dark web forums, emerging technology that Shiraz mentioned, and the weaponisation of open source information. And of course, this is not exclusive to terrorists, a more generalised activity that is occurring across criminal networks more generally. But in the wake of the Christchurch attack, and just touching on my second point about Australian priorities, we're particularly concerned about live streaming as an issue to promulgate real-world terrorist attacks online. And we're particularly encouraged by the GIFCT's content incident protocol to address content circulating on members' platforms that then result in real-world terrorism or violent extremism events. We're developing our own domestically, our online content incident arrangements to try and reduce the virality of this content in tandem with the GIFCT process. But it's very clear from Australia's perspective, we see that the rules that apply in the physical world must apply in the digital world. And preventing terrorist and violent extremism exploitation of the internet must be a key priority for all governments, private sector, NGOs, and research institutions around the world. We see the strengthening of GIFCT with Nick, your permanent role as your inaugural executive director, as a real new era that marshals an industry response to the use of platforms by those who seek to promote their violent causes as a positive advance for the world. Australia is one of a growing member of an international chorus that says more needs to be done to make the internet a much safer place. The advent of COVID-19, the weaponisation of COVID-19 narratives by terrorists and violent extremists makes this reality, we think, more pressing. But ultimately, we think citizens will assess whether the actions undertaken by governments and by industry is sufficient to keep their own loved ones safe. So my third point in relation to the GIFCT, we're seeing the GIFCT become a more independent, platform-agnostic, ambitious and transparent organisation, and you should be commended for being that. The establishment in particular, and I think Nick mentioned this in his speech, of the working groups, we think is an important milestone in the evolution. Australia is a member of the Crisis Response and Transparency Working Groups, and we commit to actively work to further these agendas. A note on the working groups, we think that they should be focused on tangible outcomes in order to keep citizens safe. And that we know that the tradecraft of terrorists and violent extremists online will continue to adapt and we need to make sure that the working groups are at the focal point of making impactful change. And really having an outcomes-focused level of working groups, I think, will make a big difference. On platform transparency, Australia, in partnership with New Zealand, Canada and South Korea, is championing the development of the OECD Voluntary Transparency Reporting Protocol. And we think that will help create a common protocol for online platforms to publicly report what steps they are taking to prevent, detect and remove terrorist and violent extremism content. We hope this can be a good tool for the GIFCT members to provide as part of the transparency reporting and as a precondition for onboarding new members. Thank you very much for the ability to make 3 brief intervention points. And it's great to hear the range of speakers today and to hear the great work that's going on. I'd like now to pass to Adam Hadley from Tech Against Terror, and I look forward to your remarks.
Many thanks, Hamish. I'm Adam, Director of Tech Against Terrorism. First of all, I'd like to thank the GIFCT for the invitation to present today. I'd like to briefly comment on Shiraz's research and views, and also reference some of the work that we've been doing with Tech Against Terrorism in partnership with the GIFCT. So in terms of the current threat landscape, at Tech Against Terrorism, we segment the types of technology used by terrorists in a variety of ways. The first is those technologies that are used to share propaganda, radicalize and recruit. There's also operational technologies, there's emerging tech. Now, in terms of propaganda and radicalization, we're all aware, of course, of content sharing, social media, video streaming and gaming services. In reality, violent Islamist extremists and the violent far right also use file stores, archiving services, file sharing platforms. In terms of operational services, we all know about encrypted messaging, and Shiraz also mentioned the idea of hostile open source intelligence. Underneath this, it's also important to stress the increased prevalence of terrorist use of internet infrastructure. So this is in creating their own websites using domain name registrars, hosting, denial of service providers, and increasingly decentralized file servers, which I'll come on to in a few short moments. In terms of emerging tech, there are 4 key areas. The first is around decentralized file servers. The second is decentralized messaging platforms. And also we're seeing the emergence of bespoke apps and technologies being created, as well as, of course, the co-option of fringe platforms by violent extremists. In terms of violent Islamist extremists, the following framework is often helpful for us when we're trying to understand what is an incredibly complex threat landscape. Firstly, we look at beacons, typically messaging apps. So this could be Telegram, Hoot Messenger, Threema. Then there are content stores, which are used to store material, PDFs, videos, audio, etc. And there are aggregators. And also there are circumvention sites as well. So this slide reflects the threat landscape from the point of view of violent Islamist extremism. In a sense, there is equivalent with the extreme far right as well, but different apps typically used. Telegram is central to the use of the internet by the extreme far right, but there are other services as well that are used to share videos and such like. To provide a bit more detail, over the past 7 days at Tech Against Terrorism, we've monitored one particular smaller messaging app, and we found over 800 unique IS-related outlinks, leading to 90 different platforms, which we hope demonstrates the scale of the problem that we face. So with this particular messaging app, 800 unique links were distributed in the following way in terms of outlinks. So with file sharing, there were more than 15 file sharing destinations. So these include upload files.fm, etc., as we can see on the slide. This is really problematic because what we often find is a messaging app can be used by IS-related actors to share content over as many as 50 or 60 platforms simultaneously. There's also reference to other messaging apps, Telegram, Hoot Messenger, Threema, some content stores, mainly top for top, also some large file stores run by big organizations. We also have reference to video streaming platforms, decentralized messaging apps like Riot and Rocket Chat, Internet Archive, file servers, and a number of other services. So what we see here is that over the past year, we've seen more focus on file sharing and the emergence of decentralized messaging and decentralized file servers. However, it's not all bad news. Within the past 7 days, looking at this particular data set, we found that actually the vast majority of content had been proactively removed by platforms. However, there are still some concerns about the prevalence, the continued prevalence of this content on file sharing systems, decentralized messaging apps, and file servers. And the file servers is something that the most concerns us, especially when we're talking about so-called terrorist-operated websites that have a domain name that you can type in, then leads to a decentralized file system that is very difficult to take down. Many of these actually are hosted in Germany and Switzerland and are paid services. It's not just about violent Islamist extremism, of course. Where the extreme far right is concerned and the violent far right is concerned, the go-to is Telegram. And this demonstrates one dashboard we have in monitoring how Telegram is used by designated far right organizations and other violent extremist groups. So in terms of three trends then, first of all, we're seeing, at least for IS-related violent Islamist extremists, a tentative partial migration from Telegram. After the partially successful takedown from Telegram in November and December last year, there has been significant migration to Hoop, Riot, and Rocket Chat. However, there are sustained attempts to regain access and use of Telegram, so certainly not over there. However, for the extreme far right, Telegram is used in abundance by the extreme far right. The second trend is the persistence of content on file platforms, file servers, file sharing sites. This is really worrying for us. Most platforms, or even very small ones, are very good at removing content quite quickly, according to our research, but this doesn't apply to the file servers. What we're also seeing is that as smaller sites get better at removing content, a lot of the media, videos, etc., stay on the messaging apps. So as a trend, we're seeing increased persistence of content on the likes of Telegram and Hoop and other systems. And the third trend is around the increased sophistication. So Shiraz mentioned a pamphlet about an OPSEC guide on Telegram, I think earlier. Well, actually, a number of IS groups and others regularly produce incredibly detailed reports and guides about how to increase their operational security online. Sometimes kind of relating to active hacking measures. We're also seeing the emergence of terrorist-operated websites. And really here, we're calling for government actors to build capacity to consider measures that can be taken against websites that have been created by terrorists themselves. Certainly, in these cases, it's not possible to reach out to the websites and ask them to change their terms of service if they have actually been created by terrorists. Also, worryingly, we're seeing the emergence of decentralized file servers. As I've said, some of these, in fact, most of them are hosted in Germany and Switzerland, and worryingly, are paid services also. So that brings an end to the kind of the threat overview. In the last couple of minutes I have, just a quick summary of what we've been doing in support of the GIFCT over the past year. So we focus on outreach with smaller platforms. So at any one point, we're talking to around 10, 11 smaller platforms. We then aim to share best practice about how smaller platforms can best deal with the threat in a responsible way that's in support of human rights and freedom of expression. Thirdly, we build capacity through operational support. So I've only got a minute or two left, but just I'll flash this up anyway. So in terms of webinars, we've already had 6 webinars this year with a total of more than 600 respondents and participants. Since last year, we've had 2 very successful workshops in partnership with the GIFCT, including in Delhi in November and in London with Facebook and the FBI. We also have a podcast and lots of other things. We carry out our own research on open source. And the main thrust of what we do, as Nick mentioned earlier, is mentorship. So we work very closely with tech platforms of all sizes to help them improve their terms of service, improve content moderation policy, and pretty much anything that a small platform might need to know, including connecting them to experts and government officials. And finally, we're working on developing our own technical solutions. So previously, we helped Aaron Zellin at Geodology, Password Protect Geodology, and we continue to maintain that. We're building the terrorist content analytics platform funded by Public Safety Canada, and of course, we're an active member of GIFCT working groups. So in terms of the TCAP, quickly, the TCAP terrorist content analytics platform is designed to scrape PDFs, URLs, images, etc., to be the world's largest database of verified terrorist content. And in the first phase, which we're developing now, this is supporting smaller tech platforms to help them discover content. Later on in the year, next year, we'll be building out the TCAP to support academic analysis. And finally, in 2021, we'll be building an algorithmic layer on top of this to support improved classification of terrorist material. So this is the brief timeline of developing the TCAP. If anyone would like further information or would like to be a beta tester for this system, please let me know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. That was terrific. And I want to say thank you to Shiraz and our 4 distinguished panelists for such a rich conversation about the threat landscape. It puts a terrific frame around what is a problem set we all know and understand, but one that is evolving all the time. And again, multiple of our experts referenced how even COVID-19 and the global pandemic environment we're all living in has influenced the extremist narrative, the violent extremist narrative. And so it just speaks to the evolutionary or the evolving nature of this threat landscape. And it's probably worth reminding ourselves that, again, as Farah mentioned, this problem gets more complex and harder the longer we fail to fall short of or fail to step up to coming up with the concrete solutions that we need. I'm conscious of time. We deliberately wanted to limit a number of hours. We made people sit in front of a screen watching in their homes. This brings to a close our first session. The idea was to use this first session to both introduce the new structure of GIFCT, provide an analytical frame for a more detailed conversation in the second session that will focus on the work of the GIFCT working groups. And so I encourage you, if you're able, to join for that session later today. If not, consume it at your leisure via our webpage whenever that is possible. But again, let me close by thanking all of our speakers thus far. I look forward to participation this afternoon from as many of you as are able, and please stay safe and stay secure wherever you are. Thank you.